The paper felt thin and cold between my fingers, somehow both flimsy and heavy with unspoken weight. It was a bank statement, innocuous at first glance, standard issue, white paper, black ink. A list of transactions, dates, amounts. Routine. Until my eyes snagged on a line item near the bottom. A wire transfer. The date swam into focus just a few months ago. The amount was substantial, not astronomical, but enough to make me pause. Enough to feel significant. And then I saw the recipient. It wasn't a vendor, not a bill. It was the Internal Revenue Service. Okay, taxes. Maybe quarterly? But the account was his personal one. Not the joint account we used for household expenses, not his business account. Why was he paying taxes from here? My breath hitched, a small, sharp sound in the quiet house. I scanned the line again, my gaze fixated on the memo field, a small string of characters that suddenly vibrated with seismic energy. It wasn't a company name, not even estimated tax, it was a social security number. Not his. Not mine. A different one. Cold dread, a sensation like sipping iced water too fast, shot through me. I knew that number. My mind, usually a torrent of anxious thoughts, went utterly silent, suspended in disbelief. It was her number. Sarah. The name itself tasted like ash on my tongue. Sarah. His distraction. His affair. My hand started to tremble, the paper rattling faintly. Why would he pay her taxes? Her back taxes, the memo seemed to imply, a lump sum clearing an old debt. The air in the room grew thick, suddenly suffocating. The scent of the old paper, usually faint, seemed overpowering, musty and revealing. My ears strained, listening for the sound of his car in the driveway, the click of the lock, the normal sounds of a life that was, in this instant, shattering around me. My chest tightened, a physical vice squeezing the breath from my lungs. My fingers clenched, crumpling the edge of the statement. The ink seemed to blur, the numbers dancing like malevolent sprites celebrating my sudden, stark understanding. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had financially entangled himself with her, paid her debts she owed the government. A debt serious enough to warrant a significant wire transfer. It wasn't just sex. It was a calculated act of, what? Protection? Investment? It felt colder, somehow, more deliberate than a fleeting mistake. This felt like a pact. And I was staring at the receipt. The quiet house became a tomb, the silence amplifying the sound of my own frantic heartbeat drumming a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. The afternoon sun, usually a comforting wash of warmth through the window, felt harsh and exposing. Every object in the room, the couch where we watched movies, the table where we ate dinner, the rug where we stood exchanging polite, meaningless words, now felt alien, stained by this unseen transaction, this hidden agreement made behind my back. I was standing in the ruins of my life, holding the blueprint of its destruction. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, it helps me more than you know. The paper dropped from my numb fingers, fluttering to the floor like a wounded bird. I didn't pick it up. I couldn't move. I stood there, anchored to the spot by the sheer force of the revelation, the betrayal not just a stab wound but a slow, spreading poison chilling my very core. It wasn't just the affair anymore. That was a brutal enough blow, a seismic shift in the landscape of my marriage, discovered weeks ago in a series of gut-wrenching confirmations, lies unraveling like cheap yarn. The late nights that weren't late nights at the office, the hushed phone calls, the sudden secrecy around his phone. The telltale signs that, once you see them, you can't unsee. The denial had been his first weapon, deployed with a practiced ease that chilled me. Nothing is going on. His eyes, usually a warm, familiar blue, had been like chips of ice. You're imagining things. The gaslighting, a slow twisting of the knife. You're being paranoid. You're stressed. Making me the problem, deflecting from his own calculated deceit. That part had hurt, had burned with the specific agony of being lied to by the person you trusted most. But this was different. This IRS payment. It wasn't about stolen nights or whispered words or even shared feelings, if they had any. This was money, real money, transferred to the government on behalf of his mistress. It felt transactional, cold, and deeply, profoundly significant. It wasn't just a symptom of the affair. It felt like a purpose. Why the IRS? Why her back taxes? What kind of situation was she in that she owed the government? And more importantly, what kind of hold did she have over him, or what kind of commitment did he feel towards her, that he would step in and clear a debt that wasn't his? This wasn't a gift of flowers or a weekend getaway. This was a serious financial intervention. It spoke of a level of entanglement I hadn't grasped. It elevated her from a temporary diversion, a cliché, to something else entirely. A partner in something secret, something that involved clearing her slate, potentially making her free and clear of some looming problem. Was she in trouble? Was he bailing her out? Was he protecting her? And, by extension, perhaps protecting himself from whatever repercussions she might face? A chilling thought began to form, tendrils of ice spreading through the initial shock. Was this linked to him? Was her tax issue somehow connected to their activities? Unreported income, perhaps? Skimming? The questions swirled, each one darker than the last, painting a picture far more complex and dangerous than simple infidelity. The house felt cold now, the silence no longer peaceful but oppressive. I walked, zombie-like, to the kitchen, the crumpled statement still on the floor, in the other room. I needed coffee. Something hot, something real. My hands fumbled with the filters, the coffee maker a familiar machine in an unfamiliar world. Every movement felt heavy, disconnected. My own body felt alien, numb from the neck down, my head buzzing with frantic, disjointed thoughts. How long had this been going on? Not just the affair, but this level of financial commitment? Had there been other payments? Other secrets buried in bank statements and hidden documents? The realization hit me with sickening force. I knew nothing. The man I had built a life with, shared a bed with, signed mortgages with, was a stranger. A stranger who had been living a parallel life, a secret life, right under my nose, weaving a web of deceit that extended beyond the emotional and physical betrayal into the cold, hard world of money and government agencies. I sat at the kitchen table, the mug warming my hands, the bitter coffee doing little to cut through the chill that had settled in my bones. My gaze fell on a photo on the fridge, a picture of us smiling on a beach years ago. We looked happy, genuine. Was it real then? Or had the capacity for this kind of deception always been there, lurking beneath the surface? The memories flooded back, little moments that now felt tainted, reinterpreted through the lens of this new, horrifying knowledge. The times he was suddenly unreachable. The unexplained withdrawals. The way he'd flinch if I glanced at his phone notifications. Things I'd dismissed as stress, as him needing space, as normal marital ebbs and flows. I felt like a fool. A complete and utter fool. Not just for not seeing the affair, but for not seeing the man. The calculating, secretive stranger who could orchestrate something like this. The early struggles were less about confrontation and more about internal chaos. I couldn't speak. The words of accusation felt lodged in my throat, sharp and unyielding. I needed proof. More proof than a single wire transfer, even one as damning as this. What if there was an innocent explanation? The desperate, foolish part of my mind whispered. Maybe she borrowed money? Maybe he was helping her out as a friend, a terrible, boundary-crossing friend? But the IRS part, that screamed something different. It screamed debt. It screamed trouble. And it screamed that he had paid to make her problem disappear. My gut, which had been screaming warnings for weeks, clenched tighter. There was no innocent explanation for paying your mistress's back taxes to the federal government. This was complicity. The next few days were a blur of forced smiles and strained conversations. He acted normally, maybe a little too normally. Overly cheerful, making jokes that fell flat in the cavernous space that had opened between us. Every time he spoke, I heard the echo of that wire transfer, the quiet hum of his deception vibrating beneath his words. I watched him, really watched him, for the first time in years, seeing a stranger in his eyes. He was comfortable in his lies, or perhaps just arrogant enough to believe he wouldn't get caught. The thought made my blood run cold. How many other secrets did he have? I knew I couldn't stay silent forever, but I couldn't confront him yet. Not without a plan. Not without knowing the full extent of the damage, the full depth of his betrayal. The thought of his reaction, the probable denial, the anger, the twisted attempt to turn it back on me, was exhausting before it even happened. I needed leverage. I needed someone who understood the dark corners of financial entanglement, someone who could see the truth buried beneath the lies. That's when I started looking for an attorney. Not just a divorce attorney, but someone sharp, someone who understood financial forensics, someone who wasn't afraid to dig. The process was daunting. Meeting with strangers, repeating the bare, humiliating facts of my crumbling marriage, ending with the bombshell about the IRS payment. Most nodded sympathetically at the affair part. Some bristled with professional interest at the financial transaction. They asked questions I couldn't answer. Why do you think she owed back taxes? Was she self-employed? Was there a business connection? My ignorance felt like a heavy cloak. I knew so little about her, less about her finances, and apparently nothing at all about the man I married. The rising challenges began immediately after I found her.
Sarah.
My husband's name for her was Sarah. The discovery itself had been a clumsy accident, a dropped phone, a screen lit up with a message notification, just a snippet, a first name, a familiar emoji that he used only with me, suddenly twisted and used with her. That first wave of nausea, the world tilting on its axis. Then came the confirmation, piecing together the puzzle from late-night texts he thought he'd deleted, credit card statements with unfamiliar charges in distant neighborhoods, the sudden busyness that always seemed to coincide with his phone being turned off or left behind. The affair itself was a standard, soul-crushing betrayal. Painful, yes. Humiliating, absolutely. But this tax payment, that took it to a different level entirely. My initial attempts to get information were pathetic. I wasn't a spy. I wasn't cunning. I was a wife, blindsided. I tried subtle questions, leaving bank statements carelessly on the counter, watching for a reaction. Nothing. He was a stone wall. I tried accessing joint accounts, but he'd already moved funds, changed passwords. A chilling efficiency I hadn't known he possessed. He was preparing for me to find out, or perhaps preparing for something else entirely. His actions made the casual betrayal feel strategic, calculated. He wasn't just cheating, he was building a fortress. The legal challenges mounted quickly. Once I found the right attorney, a woman named Evelyn with eyes like chips of blue ice and a mind like a steel trap, the gloves came off. She didn't waste time on platitudes. She listened to the affair story, nodded, and then leaned forward when I mentioned the IRS payment. "Tell me everything about that," she'd said, her voice low and sharp. "The date, the amount, the memo line. Everything you remember." I recounted the details, my voice trembling less from emotion and more from the sheer, cold facts. The SSN. The IRS. Back taxes. I repeated, the words feeling sterile and loaded at the same time. Evelyn's expression changed. It wasn't just sympathy anymore. It was professional curiosity, the scent of something legally significant. Filing for divorce was the official line in the sand. It felt surreal, signing papers that dissolved a life built over a decade. The day the papers were served was awful. He didn't rage. He didn't plead. He went cold, glacial. His eyes, those familiar blue eyes, were like a stranger's. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Not a threat, exactly, but a statement of absolute certainty that sent shivers down my spine. He believed he was untouchable. He believed he held all the cards. He hired a shark of his own, a man known for aggressive tactics, for burying the opposition in paperwork and draining their resources. The legal battle began as a slow, grinding war of attrition. Requests for documents, interrogatories, depositions. Evelyn warned me this would happen. He wasn't just fighting the divorce, he was fighting to protect his secrets. The financial discovery process became a battleground. He dragged his feet, delayed, claimed documents were lost, incomplete. It was frustrating, soul-crushing work, feeling like we were sifting through mountains of sand looking for a handful of diamonds. Every step forward felt like wading through mud. Meanwhile, the personal attacks began. Subtle at first, then escalating. Phone calls where he'd just sigh heavily, or make veiled comments about my mental state, implying I was unstable, imagining things. He tried to isolate me from mutual friends, spreading a narrative that I had gone crazy. I had blown up the marriage over nothing. Some friends believed him. The calls stopped. The invitations dried up. The isolation was a heavy weight, confirming the chilling effectiveness of his campaign to control the story. I felt like my world was shrinking, the walls closing in. But Evelyn kept digging. Her team, quiet, relentless financial detectives, followed the scent of that IRS payment like bloodhounds. They traced the SSN, cross-referenced it with public records, pieced together Sarah's financial history as much as possible. The midpoint shift came slowly, subtly, a dawning realization rather than a sudden shock. It wasn't just that Sarah owed back taxes. It was how she likely owed them, and what paying them meant for him. Evelyn called me into her office. The air conditioning was always too cold, the leather chair stiff. She laid out a timeline, a flow chart of transactions and dates. The IRS payment was a nodal point. "We think we've figured out Sarah's situation," she said, her voice quiet, serious. "It appears she was operating, let's call it a cash business, for a few years. Substantial income. Largely unreported, my stomach clenched. A cash business? What kind of cash business?" Without getting into specifics that aren't strictly relevant legally, Evelyn continued, her gaze steady. It generated significant income that wasn't going through traditional channels. And she wasn't reporting it. My mind raced. Was she an escort? A drug dealer? The possibilities were sordid, ugly. But Evelyn steered me back to the legal point. The problem for her, she explained, was the IRS eventually caught on, audited her, hit her with a significant tax bill, penalties, interest. "That's what your husband paid." Okay, I knew that. But why was this a shift? "Here's where it gets tricky for him," Evelyn said, leaning forward. Paying her back taxes wasn't just a generous gift. Depending on the specifics, his knowledge of her activities, the source of the money he used, whether he benefited in any way from her unreported income, this payment could potentially be seen as facilitating, aiding, or even being complicit in her tax evasion. Complicity. The word hung in the cold air. It wasn't just about his infidelity anymore. It wasn't just about him financially supporting his mistress. It was about him potentially breaking the law to clean up her mess. It made the betrayal feel even dirtier, tangled in the murky world of unreported income and dodging the federal government. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of calculation, possibly to protect himself as much as her. "This changes things," Evelyn stated plainly. "His defense has been that he's a victim of your paranoia, that his finances are above board, that the affair, while regrettable, is a private matter separate from the financial settlement. He's trying to portray himself as a responsible, if flawed, man. This transaction paints a very different picture. It shows a willingness to engage in potentially illicit financial activity for his mistress. It suggests a pattern of behavior, a disregard for the law, and a motive to hide assets or obscure financial ties. This wasn't just dirt anymore. This was a weapon. A devastating legal weapon. If he could be shown to have potentially aided tax evasion, his credibility in court would be destroyed. His claims about his own finances would be suspect. The financial picture he was presenting could be torn apart. The possibility of this hung in the air, heavy with implication. This wasn't just about getting a fair divorce settlement anymore. This was about exposing him, holding him accountable not just for breaking my heart, but for potentially breaking the law. The focus of the fight shifted from personal pain to strategic legal warfare. The rules of engagement changed. The deepening crisis phase settled in, a suffocating blanket of stress and anxiety. Despite the potential leverage the IRS payment discovery offered, the legal battle felt increasingly insurmountable. My husband, or rather, his shark of an attorney, intensified their tactics. The paperwork barrage increased tenfold. Motions were filed contesting every single request we made for financial information. Depositions were scheduled and then canceled last minute, costing us time and money. My own legal bills began to climb, a constant, terrifying reminder of the financial cost of this fight. There were days I stared at the invoices and felt physically sick. Was this worth it? Could I even afford to see this through? His attorney also filed motions intended to discredit me, bringing up old, unrelated issues, attempting to paint me as emotionally unstable, financially irresponsible, anything to undermine my credibility in court. It felt like they were throwing everything at the wall, hoping something would stick, hoping to bury me in the mud and convince the judge I was a vexatious litigant, not a wronged wife seeking a fair outcome. The stress was immense. Sleep became a luxury I rarely afforded. My appetite vanished. I felt thin, brittle, worn down to the bone. He used our limited interactions outside of court to twist the knife. Phone calls about logistics for dividing belongings would devolve into thinly veiled threats or reminders of his power. "You know, this is costing you a lot," he'd say, his voice deceptively smooth. "Think about how much more you could have if we just settled this quietly." It was a blatant attempt to intimidate me into backing down, to settle for far less than I deserved, to keep the IRS issue buried. He was confident, radiating an arrogance that made my skin crawl. He believed he had me cornered, financially and emotionally exhausted. There was a particularly bad week where everything seemed to hit at once. My car broke down, requiring an expensive repair I hadn't budgeted for. A crucial piece of evidence we were expecting from his bank was mysteriously delayed again. Evelyn's paralegal called with yet another motion his attorney had filed, demanding a response within 24 hours. I remember standing in my living room, the room that used to be ours, feeling the walls literally pressing in. The silence of the empty house was deafening. Every object felt like a monument to a failed life, a constant reminder of the man who had lied to me, betrayed me, and was now actively trying to destroy me financially and reputationally. I sank to the floor, the old rug rough against my cheek. Tears came then, hot and heavy, blurring my vision. It felt hopeless. He was powerful, wealthy, connected. He had an expensive lawyer who played dirty. I was just me, a woman fighting for her life back, armed with little more than the cold facts of his deceit, and a lawyer who believed in me. But belief didn't pay the bills. Belief didn't conjure missing documents. Belief didn't stop his attacks. I felt defeated. Utterly, completely defeated. The thought of giving up, of just signing whatever papers they put in front of me just to make it stop, was a siren song in the darkness. Let him keep his secrets. Let him keep his money. Just let me have my peace back. That night, curled up in bed, staring at the ceiling, the thought of giving up felt overwhelmingly tempting. It was exhaustion talking, the deep bone weariness of prolonged conflict. But then another thought surfaced, quiet but firm. If I gave up now, he would win completely. He wouldn't just get away with the affair and the financial manipulation in the divorce. He would get away with paying off his mistress's back taxes, a move that felt profoundly wrong, morally and potentially legally. He would get away with treating me like a disposable inconvenience, someone he could lie to, discard, and then crush when I dared to object. If I gave up, he would win. And the thought of him winning, walking away from the wreckage of my life unscathed, felt worse than any financial loss, any emotional pain. It felt like an absolute negation of everything I believed in: fairness, honesty, accountability. The turning point wasn't a sudden surge of strength, but a quiet, cold hardening of resolve. It happened gradually, building over those weeks of relentless pressure, but crystallizing in that moment of near-total despair. Lying there in the dark, listening to the silence, I realized something fundamental. He wasn't just trying to beat me, he was trying to erase me. To erase my pain, my truth, my very existence from the narrative. And I couldn't let him. The tax evasion evidence wasn't just leverage, it was the truth. It was a crack in his carefully constructed facade. It showed a side of him he desperately wanted to keep hidden. It was the one thing he seemed genuinely afraid of. His aggression, his delays, his attempts to paint me as unstable, they all stemmed from a desperate fear that this particular secret would come to light. I sat up in bed, the sheets tangled around me. The exhaustion was still there, a dull ache in my limbs, but something else had surfaced. A cold, quiet determination. This wasn't about revenge. Not exactly. It was about setting the record straight. It was about refusing to be erased. It was about using the truth, the ugly, messy truth, as my weapon. I called Evelyn first thing the next morning. My voice was steady, devoid of the usual anxiety. "I'm ready," I said. "We use it. The tax information. We put it front and center." Evelyn paused, a rare silence from her end of the line. "Are you sure?" she asked finally. "This is a high-stakes move. It will make things very difficult for him, yes, but it will also make the proceedings more contentious, potentially draw more attention. It could lead to investigations beyond the divorce court." "I'm sure," I repeated, my grip tightening on the phone. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce resolve. He thinks he can bury me. He thinks I'll crumble. I won't. We use the truth. All of it. There was another pause, then Evelyn's voice, tinged with respect. "Okay," she said. "Then that's our strategy. We prepare the motion. We gather every single piece of evidence related to that payment, the source of the funds, the timing, everything we have on her tax situation. We make it undeniable." From that moment on, the focus shifted. The endless back and forth over standard divorce financials continued, but in the background, Evelyn's team was building the case for the tax evasion angle. We compiled the bank statement, the memo line showing the SSN and back taxes, any corroborating evidence they'd found about Sarah's business and her interactions with the IRS. We consulted with a forensic accountant who provided an opinion on the implications of such a payment. The days leading up to the hearing were tense. This wasn't the final divorce trial, but a crucial evidentiary hearing where we would argue for the inclusion of this financial information as relevant to the divorce proceedings and his financial credibility. If the judge allowed it, it would shatter his defense and force a complete reevaluation of the case. If the judge disallowed it, well, I didn't let myself think about that. I practiced with Evelyn, going over my testimony, steeling myself for his attorney's probable attempts to rattle me, to twist my words, to paint me as a bitter, vindictive ex-wife making wild accusations. I focused on the facts, the bank statement, the SSN, the IRS, the objective proof of his actions. It wasn't about emotion in that courtroom. It was about presenting the cold, hard truth. The determination had replaced despair, but the anxiety remained, a knot in my stomach that tightened with every passing hour. This was it. The moment of truth. The gamble. My future, my financial security, perhaps even a measure of justice, rested on the outcome of this hearing. I wasn't just fighting for a divorce settlement. I was fighting for the right to expose the truth about the man who had tried to bury me. The courtroom loomed like a coliseum, and I was walking in, armed with nothing but a piece of paper and a fierce, quiet resolve. The courtroom air was thick and still, smelling faintly of old paper and polished wood. It was smaller than I'd imagined, less imposing, yet the tension within its walls was palpable, vibrating just beneath the surface of the formal procedures. The judge sat elevated, a figure of quiet authority. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys, ready to capture every word. My husband sat at the table opposite ours, beside his attorney. He looked confident, almost smug. He avoided my eyes, focusing straight ahead, but there was a subtle tension in his jaw, a flicker of unease he couldn't entirely mask. His attorney, the shark, exuded an air of practiced aggression, his movements sharp and precise as he shuffled papers. I sat beside Evelyn, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap my knuckles were white. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence. We were here for the evidentiary hearing, the crucial step, where we would ask the judge to formally consider the evidence we had uncovered regarding the IRS payment. This wasn't the main event, but it felt like it. This was the moment we would lay our cards on the table, the cards he desperately wanted to keep hidden. Evelyn began methodically, laying the groundwork. She presented basic financial documents, establishing his income, our joint assets, setting the scene of the divorce proceedings. It was dry, technical stuff, but each point was a building block, leading inexorably to the one he feared. He shifted in his seat, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but I saw it. He knew where this was going. Then, Evelyn turned to the contested evidence. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady, addressing the judge. "We have uncovered a financial transaction that we believe is highly relevant to the determination of marital assets, the source of funds, and the credibility of the respondent's financial disclosures." She spoke the words, "respondent's financial disclosures," with just the slightest emphasis, highlighting his potential dishonesty. His attorney objected immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Speculation. Irrelevant." His voice was loud, designed to disrupt, to paint Evelyn's line of argument as frivolous. "Response," the judge asked, turning to Evelyn. "Your Honor," Evelyn continued, unperturbed. "The transaction in question is a substantial wire transfer from the respondent's personal account, made to the Internal Revenue Service, on behalf of a third party. We have evidence showing this payment was specifically designated for that individual's back taxes, including penalties and interest related to unreported income." She held up a document, the bank statement, enlarged and clear. "We have the account number, the date, the amount, and the memo line clearly showing the third party's social security number and the designation, IRS tax payment, back taxes." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. The courtroom felt even colder now, the silence absolute except for the faint hum of the ventilation system. My husband was no longer looking smug. His face had gone pale, a sickly gray color spreading from his neck upwards. He stared at the document Evelyn held, his eyes wide, disbelieving. He hadn't thought we could get this far. He hadn't thought we had the concrete proof. Evelyn pressed on, relentless. "Furthermore, Your Honor, our investigation suggests the source of these back taxes stemmed from potentially illegal or, at minimum, unreported income activities by this third party during the period of the marriage. The respondent's decision to utilize marital or potentially commingled funds to clear this significant debt raises serious questions regarding the nature of his relationship with a third party, the potential for undisclosed marital assets, and the respondent's potential complicity in or knowledge of these illegal activities." She didn't mention Sarah's name. She didn't need to. The SSN on the document was the silent, irrefutable identifier. She didn't make wild accusations, but used careful, legal language. Potentially illegal, potentially complicity, raises serious questions. It was enough. More than enough. His attorney was on his feet again, sputtering objections. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. Character assassination. This has nothing to do with the divorce. It's a personal matter." "Your Honor," Evelyn countered calmly, "when a party to a divorce uses substantial funds in a manner that potentially involves illegal activity or the protection of another party engaged in such activity, it is absolutely relevant to understanding the true marital estate, tracing funds, and assessing the credibility of that party's financial declarations. We are not here to prosecute tax evasion, Your Honor. We are here to ensure a fair and accurate accounting of marital assets and liabilities." The judge listened, his expression neutral, but I saw his gaze flick from Evelyn to the document, then to my husband's ashen face. My husband's eyes were fixed on his attorney now, a silent, desperate plea. He leaned over, whispering frantically, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He had been completely blindsided. He thought he had buried this secret deep enough. He thought his delays, his obfuscation, his attacks on me would prevent this moment. He was wrong. The judge leaned back in his chair, considering. The silence stretched, taut and heavy. I held my breath. This was the peak confrontation, the moment years of deception crashed headfirst into documented truth. "Counsel," the judge said finally, addressing Evelyn. "You have presented sufficient prima facie evidence, a specific, documented payment to the IRS for a third party's back taxes using respondent's account, to raise legitimate questions about the source and use of funds during the marriage and, potentially, the respondent's financial probity. While this court is not the venue for determining tax liability or criminal complicity, the relevance to the scope and valuation of marital assets, potential dissipation of those assets, and the credibility of financial disclosures in this divorce proceeding is clear." He looked directly at my husband's attorney. "The objection is overruled. The evidence regarding the payment of the third party's back taxes is admissible. I will allow discovery into the source of the funds used for this payment and any related financial interactions between the respondent and the third party that may shed light on the nature of marital assets or potential dissipation. You may proceed." A small, involuntary shudder ran through me, not of fear, but of a cold, profound satisfaction. Evelyn's face remained impassive, but her eyes met mine for a fleeting second, a shared understanding passing between us. My husband's face was a mask of shock and dawning horror. He froze, completely still, staring at the judge, then at the bank statement on the table. His carefully constructed facade had just shattered. The foundation of his defense crumbled before his eyes. He had paid to make one problem disappear, and in doing so, had created a far bigger one, a legal liability that now threatened to expose everything he had fought to hide. He had thought he was the puppet master, pulling the strings. But in that moment, holding the simple piece of paper that documented his secret, I had turned the tables. The victim had won. The betrayer was caught, exposed, and facing a reckoning far worse than he had ever anticipated. The courtroom, moments ago stifling with anxiety, now felt charged with a stark, undeniable victory. We left the courtroom in a strange sort of silence. The immediate aftermath wasn't a scene of triumphant celebration, but a quiet, almost numb processing of what had just happened. Evelyn gave my arm a brief, firm squeeze. "You did well," she said, her voice low. "You were strong. You stuck to the facts." My legs felt unsteady as we walked down the courthouse steps into the harsh afternoon light. The air outside felt different, lighter perhaps, but the weight in my chest remained. My husband and his attorney were far behind us, presumably having an urgent, unpleasant conversation. I didn't look back. The victory in court felt hollow, tinged with the bitterness of how we got here. It wasn't a celebration of winning, but a stark acknowledgement that things had been this bad, this deceitful, this ugly. The fact that exposing my husband's potential legal entanglement was the key to securing a fair divorce settlement was a tragic testament to the depths of his betrayal and the lengths I had to go to protect myself. The legal implications of the judge's ruling would unfold over time. The financial discovery would intensify, delving into the source of the money used for the IRS payment, potentially uncovering other hidden assets or transactions. The possibility of investigations beyond the divorce court loomed, a consequence of his actions I hadn't initially sought but which felt like a necessary, if harsh, form of accountability. He had gambled and lost, his arrogance leading him to believe he could hide such a significant, documented act. The days that followed were a slow, quiet decompression. The intense pressure of the legal battle didn't vanish overnight, but the dynamic had shifted. He was on the defensive now, scrambling to mitigate the damage. His attempts to intimidate me stopped. The attacks on my character ceased. He knew he had been caught. The playing field, so uneven for so long, felt level now, maybe even tilted slightly in my favor. I spent a lot of time alone processing. The anger was still there, a simmering ember, but it was mixed with exhaustion and a strange sense of peace. The truth was out. The biggest, ugliest secret was exposed. I no longer had to carry the weight of it alone, nor did I have to fight his lies in the dark. The light, harsh as it was now shining on him. The house felt less like a tomb and more like a space waiting to be reclaimed. Each object, once tainted by his deceit, now felt neutral. Just things. Things that could be sorted, packed, moved. The process of physically dismantling our shared life began, item by item. It was tedious, emotionally draining work, sorting through memories embodied in objects. His things went into boxes for him to retrieve. My things, the things I would take to build a new life, were packed with a quiet, determined purpose. There wasn't a moment of joyful triumph. The aftermath was more subtle. It was the feeling of sleeping through the night for the first time in months. It was the ability to look in the mirror and see not a fool, but a survivor. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his deceit, so carefully constructed, had ultimately been his undoing. He hadn't just underestimated me. He had underestimated the power of truth and the paper trail it leaves behind. The financial details of the divorce would eventually be settled, influenced heavily by the evidence we uncovered and his now weakened position. There would be no grand vindication, no public shaming beyond the confines of the courtroom. But for me, the victory wasn't in the final settlement amount. It was in that moment in court, watching him freeze, the color drain from his face as he realized his secret was out, exposed not by emotion or accusation, but by a simple bank statement and the sharp, relentless logic of the law. It was the moment I took back my power, not through revenge, but through unwavering pursuit of the truth. The path ahead is uncertain, building a new life from the ground up. But I walk towards it now not as a victim of betrayal, but as someone who faced the darkness and found the light, even if it was a harsh, unflattering light shining on someone else's carefully hidden shame. The cold satisfaction of that moment in court remains, a quiet reminder that even in the face of the deepest betrayal, the truth, wielded correctly, can be the most powerful weapon of all. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. And subscribing helps bring more of these stories to life. Thanks for being here.